Experimentation and observation research are all useful techniques to discover solutions for problems within healthcare. Experimentation, quantitative research for problems in the healthcare field. Experimentation is used in quantitative research methods, and it investigates to discover if a particular treatment influences an outcome in a study, and researchers determine the effects by providing a distinct treatment to one group while abstaining it from another, then assessing how both groups score on an end result. Methods to conduct an experimental study includes participants plus designs, procedures, as well as measures with statistical analysis involved in conclusions of the effects that might incorporate hypotheses or theories being tested. When writing a method plan for an experiment, the researcher must know the participants of the experiment. If it is random, then it is a true experiment, and if there are partial or no control over random assignments of a manipulated variable of interest, then it is a quasi-experiment. A power analysis must be done before an experiment, similar to a survey design, to determine sample size determination of the experiment, basically to ensure that the study has accurate and applicable findings for issues such as generalizability. Variables must also be included in an experiment, which include the independent variable, the factor which is manipulated in the study, as opposed to the dependent variable, which is the response or the criterion variable believed to be the source of or influenced by the independent treatment conditions. Other variables such as demographic characteristics, measure variables, and confounding variables, which influence both dependent as well as independent variables, need to be taken into consideration to not negatively affect or throw off true findings included in the results, discussions, or conclusions of an experiment in quantitative research. Experimentation, quantitative research for problems in the healthcare field. The procedure for a step-by-step method in order in an experiment includes first, administering measures of the dependent variable to the research study participants. Second, categorize participants by matched pairs on basis of the scores in step 1. Then third, randomly assigns pairs, one to the experimental group while the other goes to the control group. Fourth, expose the experimental treatment to the experimental group while distributing the alternative treatment or no treatment to the control group. Fifth, dispense measures of the dependent variables to both the experiment as well as control groups. And lastly, sixth, differentiate between the outcomes of the control and experimental group using tests of statistical significance. What is being compared is usually established in experiments, with many having a between subjects design where an investigator contrasts between two or more groups. For example, a factorial design experiment involves two or more treatment variables to examine independent and simultaneous effects of treatment variables on an outcome. On the other hand, a within-group design studies a single group or individual contrasting treatments' behaviors while determining their impact in the study. And lastly, a mixed design includes both between subjects as well as within subjects variables. The type of experimental design also needs to be created in a proposed study, with three types being pre-experimental design, quasi-experimental, and true experiments. Pre-experimental design, types of experimental designs. The investigator reviews a single group without a control group and performs an intervention during the experiment in a pre-experimental design. For pre-experimental designs, the one-shot case study involves a group being exposed to a treatment followed by a measure. The one-group pre-test, post-test design incorporates a pre-test score, subsequently followed is a treatment, then a post-test for the same group. The static group comparison or post-test only with non-equivalent groups is a procedure where treatment is given only to one group, but there is a comparison group. Plus, both groups are given post-test. And finally, the alternative treatment post-test only with non-equivalent group designs is similar to the static group comparison groups, with the exceptions that the comparison group receives an alternate treatment. Quasi-experimental design, types of experimental designs. In quasi-experimental design, the researcher has experimental and control groups, but the design has partial or lack of random assignments in groups. For quasi-experimental designs, the examples include non-equivalent pre-test and post-test control group design, which is a popular approach that includes an experimental group A that only receives the treatment, as well as a control group B that are both not randomly selected and both groups receive a pre-test along with post-test. The single group interrupted time series design is a quasi-experimental design where the experimenter assesses one group before as well as after treatment. And finally, the control group interrupted time series design is a refinement of the single group interrupted time series design where two groups of participants with only one receiving treatment are not randomly assigned and observed over time. True experimental design, types of experimental designs. The researcher in a true experimental design randomly assigns participants to treatment groups. In one type of true experimental design, which is called the pre-test post-test control group design, known to be classical as well as traditional, randomly assigned groups with only experimental group A receiving treatment, but both groups A along with B are administered both a pre-test and post-test. In another true experimental design, the post-test only control group design controls for confounding effects of a pre-test with randomly assigned groups where treatment is only given to the experimental group, but both groups are measured on a post-test. And lastly, a Solomon 4 group design is a special 2x2 factorial design, with this method including random designation of participants to 4 groups with pre-tests, as well as treatments varied for all groups, though all groups receive a post-test. Observation, qualitative research method for problems in the healthcare field. In qualitative studies, a person must collect various forms of information and sometimes spend considerable periods in a natural setting. So in a qualitative observation, the investigator will write down activities as well as behaviors of those being targeted in field notes. The researcher makes field notes in an unstructured or pseudo-structured way about activities at a research site, with the observers having a choice of roles which range from being non-participants to full participants, and these notes are usually open-ended, with individuals having the ability to provide their views freely. Observations can also take place in qualitative interviews, which are face-to-face, over the telephone, or in focus groups. Interestingly, qualitative documents, which can be official reports, newspapers, journals, diaries, emails, or minutes of meetings, and finally, qualitative audio, visual, and digital materials may include social media messages, videotapes, photographs, art objects, or emails. An observation protocol is a plan to create a procedure by making records of observations in a qualitative study, and this method might be included in descriptive notes, which are an account of dialogue, report of physical settings, portraits of participants, explanation of events or activities, as well as reflexive notes, which are the researcher's intimate thoughts that include feelings, expectations, suspicions, opinions, perceptions, solutions, senses, etc. This data might also include the demographics of the date, place, and time where the observations happen. Observation types for problems in the healthcare field. The types of methods researchers use to conduct observations are as a complete participant, where the researcher conceals his or her identity, observer as participant, where the role of the researcher is known, participant as observer, where the participant role is first and the observation role is second, and lastly, complete observer, where the researcher is just observing and does not participate. Advantages to each type of observation include the researcher having experience as a participant gives them insight. Researchers being present allow them to record simultaneously. Unusual circumstances can be picked up through observations, and certain types of observations are useful in exploring uncomfortable topics that participants don't want to discuss. Disadvantages of each type of observation includes research researchers who may be viewed as being meddlesome. Discrete information may not be legally allowed to be reported. Researchers may be unskilled at observing, and also specific persons may be difficult to gain rapport with. Effectiveness of observation and experiments in the healthcare field. All of the methods and techniques of using observations and experiments covered in this PowerPoint are very helpful to solve problems within the healthcare field. If there's an issue for a company or organization, then these techniques would be incorporated in a game plan to resolve an impending problem. Observational methods must be used to locate an issue. For example, a person at a healthcare organization may be reviewing data and noticing that many people linked with the company who have diabetes are going to the emergency room often. So after detecting that problem by using the qualitative method, then correspondingly a quantitative method being developed, including some type of experiment, can be produced to solve the problem. The experiment conducted might include a pre-test and post-test about the individual's knowledge concerning diabetes, and after the information is collected, specific plans could be drawn out to get the help needed for those persons who are going to the emergency room too often. So the observation, which is a qualitative perspective, as well as experiments, which is a quantitative perspective, are very effective in resolving problems within the healthcare field, and by using the two in conjunction, which produce a mixed methods design, the resolution may even be better. Effectiveness of observation and experiments in the healthcare field. Validity and reliability are also very important in the effectiveness of observational and experimental techniques for research studies within the healthcare field. Therefore, to ensure those measures are accurate, all the proper procedures must be followed and adhered to. Some experiments may not have a generalizability factor to populations not included in the study, so demographics may be important to evaluate the effectiveness. Therefore, what works for one group may not work for a different group. Interpretations of a study are also very important measures that must be done accurately. The meanings within the study must be proper. Internal validity, external validity, as well as appropriate instrumentation, appropriate populations, and samples must all be taken into consideration, doing it the right way. Ethical implications with the use of experimentation and observation within the healthcare field. There are very deep ethical implications by using experimental and observation techniques within the healthcare field, and these considerations are very intense within all types of experiments. Experiments must be done ethically, which includes many different factors, including keeping the people being studied aware of what is going on, especially if treatment is given, and if it is relevant that the people receiving such treatment should know, for example, the type of medication they are taking. If such persons are not aware of the type of treatment that they're getting, legal implications could be created, and certain persons conducting the experiments could get into trouble. Also, the proper results must be reported, because if there are falsifications of records, this could throw off the study and make the research conducted false, which would be counteractive to the work created. If ethical considerations are conducted properly, the results can be astounding and may even cross cultures or countries to produce conclusions that might have a great effect, because healthcare research across the nations, especially among the developing countries, can promote harmony and cross-cultural understanding. Scientists can also play an important role in resolving international conflicts and contribute their share to building peace among nations.